So for those of you that don't know Kevin is with Mertz Taggart, which is a mergers and acquisitions firm that has a lot of specialization in the behavioral health space, so practice owners, things like that. I asked him to come in, Sarah asked him to come in to talk about selling your practice, what that looks like, even the basic building blocks of that, because we get asked a lot right now in our coaching sessions and on the Coffee with Ken calls and all that about selling your practice. I also know Kevin roundaboutly through a number of practice owners whose names will not go mentioned, but they've had a real successful experience with Kevin. Very happy with the process with Mertz Taggart in helping them sell their practice. So this isn't a nobody that we just grabbed off the internet. This is somebody who's a proven known quantity to other seven-figure practice owners who did successful exits. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin. If you guys have questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat. I'm going to ask my own questions as we go. We'll go about an hour-ish, and this will, again, be available to watch on reviews. So with that, I'm going to mute. Kevin, it's all yours.
All right, Ken, thank you. I appreciate the kind introduction. My name's Kevin Taggart with Mertz Taggart. The 2-minute commercial on us is we are an M&A firm that focuses only on two areas. One is home care and hospice. The other is behavioral. I run our behavioral group with a few other folks. And so we're 100% dedicated to doing nothing but behavioral deals. Generally in the $5 to $100 million enterprise value or selling price range, but we've done smaller stuff. It's honestly more difficult to sell a small one than a larger one. But that's kind of the 2-minute or less than 2-minute commercial on us. So, when Ken and I first started talking about this, he said really what we want to talk about is kind of the basics of the sale process, and then a little bit of market update, multiples, things like that. So I thought I would walk everybody through the process. And as Ken mentioned, please feel free to, text or ask questions as we go through this, and happy to address them there. And if it's something that's going to require longer, happy to schedule a sidebar conversation as well. So I think, if you've never sold a business before, and we've, as a firm and principals, have done a little over 140 transactions at this point, and I've still learned something on every single transaction. So, but some of the things that we see kind of underlying the entire process is trust. When you're buying a business or selling a business, there needs to be a trustful relationship both ways. You need to basically think that if you sign an LOI with this person, that they are actually going to close the transaction, and they need to believe that the numbers you're giving, the data that you're giving, the things that you're telling them are true and correct, because they're going to spend a lot of money in the due diligence process. We have a deal right now. It's a little bit larger one where the buyer has spent about $2.2 million thus far on attorneys, accountants, coding companies. So that's obviously a little high, but it's not uncommon for buyers to spend a couple $100,000 on due diligence. So they need to make sure that before they kind of commit to that they trust the person. So the other thing is bias. I mean, we've all got our own bias, and I'll give some examples of it as we go through. Certainly, I mean, we as an M&A firm are biased, think that you should use an M&A firm if you're going to sell your business for a variety of reasons that we'll kind of address. The other thing that people don't realize as you go through this process, and I used to own a home care company. We had about 200 employees. My current business partner helped me sell that in 2010. And so I've been through the process, on your side of the table as well. And the further you go down the process, right now, you may be contemplating it now, or a year from now, 2 years from now, 10 years from now, whenever. But the further you go down the process, the less control you have, which can be an uncomfortable feeling. And I'll give some examples of that. I mean, we've got a deal right now that it's in Washington State, which is one of the states that have put some new laws in place. There's 13 of them out there, where if you meet certain criteria, you have to notify the attorney general of the state or some sort of government entity to basically get permission to do the deal. So, we've kind of gone through the long sale process, and now we've got to go through, we're just about to sign the purchase agreement this week, and then we've got to go wait another 60 days for the attorney general to bless this or not bless it. So you just lose a little bit of control. So you kind of have to be mentally ready to go through the process. The other thing is confidentiality. People ask us all the time, should I tell my staff? Should I let my key employees know? And, generally speaking, I don't think there's any benefit to you, the business owner, to let people know any earlier than they need to. Now, there may be certain times, depending on the buyer, where you need to let a key staff member or two know, then certainly that may make sense. But highly recommend just keeping it confidential as long as you can. There's no benefit to you to let people know early. Number one reason transactions don't close really is breakdown in trust between the buyer and the seller. If you think about it, most of what you're selling is intangible. I mean, you have some computers, some desks, things like that, but 99.5% of whatever you're selling is intangible. It's not like a commercial real estate building where if you sell the building with some tenants in it, even if the tenants all go away, you still have the building, it's still worth something. There was a more on the substance abuse side, a fairly high profile group that paid um, pretty good amount of money. It was called BRC Health in Texas that basically the buyer bought it in 2020 and basically just gave it back to the bank in January. So they lost all of their equity. So that's why buyers, the trust is such an important thing. It works both ways. And again, it's a lot of it's contingent liabilities, especially if you take any kind of government payer. They want to make sure there's no clawback after you leave type of thing. Next reason transactions don't close is too much time. Things happen in the world. You think about, if you're in a state and Blue Cross is 80% of your payer and they make a rate cut, I mean, obviously that's going to have a material impact on your business. Something like COVID happens, some, crazy thing like that. Something happens with the buyer. So there's just so many variables that once you decide to do this, we typically say the process takes 6 to 12 months. Most normal transactions take somewhere in the 9 to 10 month range. So it does take some time, but I would encourage you to, once you decide to do it, to try and be as prepared as possible to get through the process. So we've broken down the process into really 12 discrete steps here. I mean, you can break it up a little bit further if you want, but this is kind of the 12 that we've broken it down into. And honestly, the first four, we're really not going to focus on today. Happy to talk to people offline. So I'll talk to them a little bit more here, but basically preparing for the sale. I mean, if you're going to sell in, say, a year from now or 2 years from now, I mean, the more time that you have to get prepared, especially your financials, um, maybe getting a second level of management in there to kind of make you less important to the business. Make sure you have good KPIs or key performance indicators, stats that you track. We see some smaller businesses in the outpatient mental health space that do a really nice job tracking different metrics, everything, having a little kind of clinician dashboard and kind of have different ways that they measure their clinicians, from number of appointments that they've seen where they can with each new client, those types of stats. And so those are things that just tell a buyer, hey, I've got a good handle on my business. I know what I'm doing. It gives them that kind of that confidence, helps start to build the trust. The next thing you may want to do is evaluate the business, get someone to do a valuation. We do valuations for free all the time for people as really a way to build relationships. And we spend a fair amount of time putting it together. And many businesses, we've done valuations in some cases for 4 or 5 years before they're ready to sell. And so we're happy to do that kind of stuff. And whether you use us or somebody else, I'm not a big fan of paying somebody to do it at this stage. Oftentimes the firms that do that aren't specialized in behavioral health, and we've seen some of them that frankly just aren't that accurate. So, and they're usually $5,000 or $10,000, maybe more. I've seen them up to 50,000. So, the next thing is the way you're selling options. Hey, do you want to, a buyer approach me? Should I just sell directly to them, or should I run a formal process? I mean, clearly this is where some of the bias comes in, but I'm a big fan of obviously whether it's us or an M&A, a reputable M&A firm. We sold a business last year where the buyer, they were approached by a buyer, so they called us. The buyer had offered them, they gave them an IOI, indication of interest, for $7 to $8 million we did a valuation for them. We said, look, I think we can certainly do better than this. They hired us and then basically said, hey, look, we really like this buyer. So my suggestion was, why don't we, go back to that buyer now that you've hired us, let them kind of resubmit their offer. And in the meantime, we'll put together the marketing materials that we'll talk about here in a little bit. And we'll get ready to go to market if this group doesn't submit something that we think is competitive. And so they came back with 11 to $12 million. I told them I still thought we could do better, and we ended up getting $15 million. So now, that's a kind of an extreme case. I'm not guaranteeing anybody that we can get them, but we've never had a case where we've gotten involved and we've gotten people less money than they were getting before. So, and oftentimes just the threat of going to market will get buyers to materially increase their offer. So, the next thing is really committing to the process mentally. We get some people that are just somewhat, burnt out for, various reasons, just dealing with clinicians, payers, all the things that come with running a business and dealing with people on a day-to-day basis. So it does take some time to maximize value. I mean, you can sell it a little bit quicker if you're just trying to unload it, but buyers still going to do a lot of that stuff. So, you just need to be mentally prepared to kind of go through this process because it really does take some time. So with that, I'll kind of go into a little bit more detail on the next 8 steps. So the first thing we do is, and everybody calls it something a little bit different, confidential information memorandum, the book, the deck, whatever you want to call it. But basically, it's generally called a 30 to 90 page kind of PowerPoint document that you really try and give some information about the history of the company, the corporate structure, ownership. Want to talk about the management team, services offered, how you get your clients. Obviously, it's going to need to include financial statements. I've got growth opportunities highlighted here because if you're thinking about, maximizing value, buyers want to know that there's still some upside to the business. And if, they think if they're buying 2 businesses, they're both $1 million in EBITDA, and one is showing that's going to be $1 million. They've been steady for the last 5 years, and that's what they're going to be. They're going to get a lower multiple, all things being equal, to a business that was maybe 750 last year. It's $1 million this year. It's growing to $1.2 million. So you really want to. That's usually one of the first things we get asked. That, and why is the owner selling? And then some of the other metrics that we mentioned. If you've got any key performance indicators that you track. We're gonna, and I won't get into, I'm assuming most of you have at least heard of EBITDA or adjusted EBITDA. You can find EBITDA numbers for public companies if you go on any of the financial sites out there, Google or E-Trade or whomever. But really with privately held companies, we're trying to come up with adjusted EBITDA. So adjusted EBITDA. So it's really anything you're running through the business. We see a lot of people that are, paying for cars, or I've seen boats, I've seen planes, I've seen all kinds of different stuff. And so, we want to kind of adjust those back and give you credit for them because the buyer is not going to have those expenses going forward. Some of the
Kevin, let
other things
me
that, yeah, go ahead, Ken.
so real quickly for anybody that's not familiar with that term, EBITDA, EBITDA, it's a fancy word for profit plus or minus some accounting measures. And what you're saying there, Kevin, is if your profitability has been artificially low because you're paying like personal expenses through there or something, the goal would be to add those back so that you show as more profitable. Is that the right
Yeah,
way of saying that?
that's very correct. And thank you for, please, sometimes I get on a roll with some of my acronyms and assume that everybody is going to understand them because I talk about them every day. But yeah, we see companies all the time that say may show, they're making $100,000, but in reality, their EBITDA can be, $1 million or $2 million, just depending, because they're running a lot of various things through the business to try and minimize taxes. I mean, we're not the IRS. Our job is to maximize value, so we try and show the business in the most favorable light. Your accountant is trying to minimize your taxes that you're going to pay in whatever legal way he or she can do so. So.
And 2 other things really quickly, Kevin. The the CIM that you're showing on here, the confidential information memorandum, this is something that you or somebody like you would do once somebody decides I want to go to market, I want to sell my practice. Like this is essentially the brochure that's circulated to buyers.
Correct. And that is again, it's call it 30 to 90 pages, depending on the complexity of the business. And it does take some work to put together. I would estimate it takes about 40 hours of our team's work to put one together. So it does take a bit of time. You know, the average time it takes us to put one of these together is about a month. And more of that is really dependent on how quickly we can get the information from our clients. Some people are great and they've got it all ready and then get it to us, and others, you know, they just either don't keep certain data and we have to make it a little skinnier than we'd like, but we try and put out a pretty robust sim if we can.
And one last thing here, just because I think some people may be hearing these discussions for the first time. When it comes to selling a company, EBITDA or profits, if you will, matter far more than revenue, correct? In other words, a $5 million practice with $1 million in profit probably will, all other things being equal, be worth more than a $10 million practice with $250,000 profit. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's definitely fair. And it's one of the things too that we look at is we try and do a you know, a balance between, like, some businesses are so profitable it's almost like we sold a psychiatric practice about a month ago. It hasn't been announced yet because they haven't told the employees, but it should be here in the next couple of weeks. And they had 50% plus margin. So that's really high margins. I mean, they really had a kind of a well-oiled machine, but we had to do a lot of explaining on that. So that's almost too profitable. You know, normal margins, you know, we see are, you know, 15 to 20 are good. You know, 30 is really good. Much above that, then we have to explain. Now, I mean, certainly that was a very competitive process. We got 15 offers on that business and we did 8 management meetings, which I'll talk about management meetings here as we go. So it was a very competitive process. And I think we probably had 100-ish or so people kind of initially reach out saying they wanted to get information on it and sign a confidentiality agreement.
And I guess one more follow-up thought, because I know everybody wonders about price and you're going to talk about some of that at the end. But if your margin is lower, say sub 15%, sub 10%, then the actual dollar amount becomes even more important. Would that be fair? That a business with 50 million in revenue and an 8% margin, that's 4 million in profit or EBITDA, that might have a shot versus a $2 million business with 8% may not be sellable. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, and I think you're right. We actually have a business that's 50 million in revenue right now. That's about 5 in EBITDA. And so it's 10% margins. And one of the, you know, some of the feedback we've gotten, which is no surprise, is that the margins are too tight, because if anything happens in that business, and the smaller you are, the tighter they are, the harder it's going to be. Just because, you know, buyers, people think that, like, private equity, they get private equity and venture capital confused in many cases. Venture capital are the ones that basically back, you know, the Facebook and the Instagram and all those types of tech companies where they expect crazy returns, and they may lose 8 out of 10 times, but the 2 that they hit more than make up for it. That's venture capital. Private equity is very conservative. So, excuse me, they're really looking for risk in the business. And so a business that has too low of margins is really considered too risky in many cases for them. So, you know, I've got price and terms listed on here. When we take a business to the market, which surprises some people, most not our buyers, and we'll talk more about the buyer universe too, but we never put a price on a business. We'll do a valuation for our clients before we go to market just to make sure we're aligned, and we'll give you, you know, usually a range of where we think it is. And then look, we try and exceed that range, and we're generally pretty good at doing that. I will say the market over the last 6 months has been a little tougher to do that, but just because we gave guidance a year ago in many cases, or more. But we never put a price on it. We create a competitive auction process where we'll take a business to market and we'll ask a buyer to submit offers. And all the private equity groups, family offices, the institutional capital and big buyers are used to that. Sometimes a newer buyer is not quite used to that, but and really, when we get offers, generally the lowest offer is, call it 35 to 40% of whatever the highest offer is. And so there's a broad range. And, you know, the goal is that we're getting offers higher than we guided for, and by creating the competitive process. So that's some of the reasons we don't. The other thing I've got on here is forecast. If you're growing, we think it's important to include the forecast in there, and it's got to be realistic, and you kind of need to hit it as you go through the process. But we like to include that as well. Speaking of buyers here, so the ones that I've got circled really are the buyer universe that we deal with. So strategic buyers are, for outpatient mental health, you can think of kind of a Refresh, which is owned by Optum, or a LifeStance, which is public, or there's a host of other groups out there that are private equity backed that are the strategic buyers. There's also some, non-strategic or strategic buyers that maybe aren't in the industry now, maybe substance abuse groups that want to get in the space, generally well capitalized. And then you've got, traditional private equity, which I'm sure all of you have heard about, family offices, which are really high net worth individuals that have either have kind of generational wealth or have sold a business and have got maybe $100 million fund or a $300 million fund or whatever. We sold a business to a family office last year that had about $5 billion of assets under management. And it was an outpatient mental health company because they had a personal connection to it. And so they were passionate about it, even though it was kind of much smaller than kind of their typical deal. And then non-traditional private equity, we're seeing a lot more groups come into the space that are either what they call independent sponsors, meaning they don't have a traditional fund, so they'll go raise money with every deal. Or there's also something called search funds, which I'm guessing a lot of you have probably been approached by those groups, where it's usually a younger person that has got a background either in private equity or they've gone to, the Wharton, Stanfords, Harvards of the world, and are trying, they've got investors to back them, where they're going to come in and be the CEO of the business, and run it. So frankly, we haven't gotten comfortable with one of those yet. We see a lot of them, but we haven't done a deal with one yet. I think we probably will this year, but I don't know. It takes me a little bit more to get comfortable with them. And the three that I don't have highlighted here are, individuals, are not great buyers for our types of deals, just generally don't have the capital for the types of deals we're doing. Family and friends, I mean, certainly if you're going to sell it to one of your family members, you really don't need us. You can sell it, get an attorney, something like that. And then competitors we don't find are ever really going to pay up, unless they're backed by private equity, are ever going to pay up where it makes sense for them to do your deal.
I want to mirror that one, because I hear that a lot of, maybe I'll just sell the other big practice in town. We've been approached a ton by competing practices. The answer always is, for the money you're wanting, I could go build twice what you're trying to sell me with no inherited problems, right? Yeah, you want $5 million for your practice, I'll spend $5 million on mine and come out ahead.
And that's exactly the reason, Ken. You're absolutely right. The difference with private equity is, if you have, say, a $500 million fund, for them, kind of speed and scale is key. And so they can enter new geographies by buying other companies. Although we've seen some recently, because multiples were pretty frothy, where they've decided to do a little bit more of a de novo or startup strategy, where they're adding additional offices because of, frankly, it's cheaper. So, but the pendulum always kind of swings back and forth. So, um, so we talked about confidentiality in this. Is like, well, how do you market to buyers without letting, you can't put a sign in the, office lobby, business for sale. So, the way we do it is, we'll put together what we call a teaser, and it's really generally a 2-pager on, highlights the positive of the company, gives, revenue and profitability trends over the last 3 years generally. Geography, we generally don't put the state, we'll put a region of the country, we'll say Southeast or Western US or Mountain or whatever, just so people can't figure it out. So really the goal there is to kind of pique somebody's interest, so they email us back and ask for a confidentiality agreement. And generally when we send these things out, just depending on the size of the business, we'll get anywhere from say, I mean, 20 on a really low interest deal, up to maybe I think 160 plus is the most we've gotten. So kind of all over the board. I'd say the average is probably 75, 80. Just guess. That's not scientific. That's just kind of gut. But that keeps your confidentiality intact. So, and if somebody forwards an email, your employees aren't going to get it and know who it is. So, as you're doing this, obviously, if you're marketing it to this many people, you really kind of you need to track it. So we track this stuff in, various stages and then add comments and then as we have conversations, we try and figure out who we're going to get the offers from, really to try and narrow the field down. So, the other thing that is part of this process, and I touched on it a little bit earlier, is a process letter. For our larger deals, we'll generally run a two-step process, meaning we'll put together the SIM, and in the SIM there will be a process letter as one of the first few slides, and we'll basically put a date in there where indications of interest are due, are called IOIs. They're a little less formal than what are called letters of intent. So an IOI is basically where a buyer will give you a range or give us a range of what they think the business is worth. They may say 6 to 7 times, 9 to 10 times, whatever the EBITDA is. And so the reason we do that is if we get too many offers, it wouldn't be a good use of your time, our time, or their time to bring 15 people in to meet with you. So we try and narrow it down to the best buyers. And usually we try and keep that to about 3 to 7. Sometimes it's 3 meetings. Sometimes it's 1 or 2, but we still, want the buyer to think it is competitive, even if it's 2 buyers. But it's just not feasible to meet with more than really 7 or 8 because it takes a good month, 6, 5 weeks to do that. So because the meetings are generally management meetings are generally 3 to 4 hours long and then a dinner. So it gets to be a little exhausting for the sellers and frankly us. So, from there, once we get the IOIs, we'll have management meetings and then we'll call for, another round of offers or LOIs. In smaller deals, sometimes we'll do just a one-stage process where we'll ask for LOIs up front. Now, at this stage, we try and insulate you so you can continue to run the business. And really, we'll probably have some questions that need to get answered via email, but we're not involving you with the buyer at this stage until we determine who's a qualified buyer and who's not. All right. So, these management meetings that we do. Go ahead, Ken. Were you going to say something?
Nope. Midway down, I'll ask a question. Keep going.
Okay. So these management meetings are really designed to kind of bolster the competition. The buyers always know that there's generally multiple meetings. There's other buyers coming in. And the thing that's interesting for people when they first, obviously we do them all the time. So, and we generally go to these meetings. The reason is that we go to them is I like to look for who's done kind of the prep work up front to really investigate. Are they going to, I'm looking for certainty to close it, with these buyers. But oftentimes our clients will be surprised if we do 5 management meetings and they'll have them ranked prior to it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just based on the offers. More often than not, the buyer who's number 1 is not number 1 after the meeting. So, we had an outpatient mental health business we were selling, and this one we did, I think, 8 management meetings for, and the highest bidder came in and was basically telling the seller, who was a female, and I've got a female on my team that does all the deals with me as well, but the buyer was basically saying to the seller, hey, if you want me to talk to your husband or if you need to ask your husband about this, and it was driving the seller crazy as well as the lady that works with me, is like, because the husband's not an owner. And so those are just the little things that you can't get through an offer, personality wise. So she just decided there was no way she was going to be able to work with this particular group. But we were able to kind of leverage their offer with other buyers. So anyway, the management meetings are just, it's kind of like a somewhat of a dating experience, especially if you're going to what's called role equity, meaning keep some ownership in the business. And so, um, it really is critical to figure out if you're going to like these people or not. Um, and sometimes we see management meetings go really well. I mean, we've had one before where after that management meeting was a very competitive situation. We got an additional $25 million out of the ultimate winning bidder. That's a little bit unusual too, but so sometimes we're able to get buyers to come up in their offers, and other times, buyers decide, hey, I learned a little bit more. This is not going to be a good fit for us, so they walk away. Um, talking about mitigating risk, my advice is always to, like, if there's issues like you're getting sued or you have an employee issue or an EEOC claim or something along those lines, the buyers are going to find it. They're hiring these law firms to basically uh, really find any risk that the business may pose. So go ahead and tell people early. I mean, you don't want to necessarily put in the sand, but you want them to know that there are issues that we're going to have to work through. And look, these professional buyers are used to dealing with these businesses. Every business has got. We're selling a business right now where they had a death in the facility. We disclosed it to the buyer, and they signed the purchase agreement. And now we're just waiting to get it closed.
So Kevin, would that include like known ethical issues with a former therapist, things like that? I mean, if you potential licensure actions, is that the stuff that they're trying to not get blind? All of us probably have that employee that we're so glad they left because they didn't do any of their notes for a year or something like that. Is that stuff that we should be disclosing, obligated to disclose, could have money taken back if it's not disclosed?
Yeah, so yes, I would think you should be telling them, depending on what it is, you are most likely legally obligated anyway, because there's things in what's called in the purchase agreement, what are called the schedules. And so the schedules are basically saying in the purchase agreement will say, hey, I warrant or represent that these things are true and correct. So like your financials, that you don't have any employee issues, you don't have any lawsuits, you don't have this. And if you do have them, you just need to list them. And then you're at least covering yourself that, hey, I did disclose them, because if they find out post-closing, they're going to have a lot more recourse than if you disclosed them and they still closed, if that makes sense.
In other words, if you close a deal based on incomplete information that the buyer, it would have changed their price, for example, then that can be recourse afterwards of we bought this on good faith. Turns out you got skeletons in the closet. This price is no longer fair. Consequences.
Yeah, and then really at that point the attorneys win, because then both sides, if it's material enough. Um, but yeah, look, most buyers don't get scared away by this kind of stuff unless it's just something. I will say, if you have government payers and you're doing something wrong on kind of the billing and coding, that often can be a deal killer, just because the government has so much more clawback ability and punitive, jail type things that they can do versus commercial payers. But I'd rather get a quick no any day of the week than to go down through this process and have them find it out anyway and then walk. And then you've kind of blown that whole trust thing that we talked about earlier.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Um, so we talked a little bit about kind of the two-stage process and whether we're getting to letters of intent through a one-stage or two-stage process. These are generally prepared by the buyer. And again, we're trying to get multiple letters of intent. And it really is kind of an outline to closing. A well-written one is generally 3 to 5 pages. I've seen them longer, but you want to put enough in there so that it's kind of an outline for the attorneys to basically build the purchase agreement, which is the legally binding document that is going to be hundreds of pages by the time you attach all the schedules to it. So, other thing we often get asked, especially by kind of first-time smaller businesses, is there a deposit? Does a buyer put down a deposit like when I'm buying a house? And the answer is generally no. Um, the reason being is they're going to spend that couple $100,000 to, and kind of, if it's a bigger deal, could be a million plus in advisor fees. And whether they close the deal or not, they're going to have to pay, all or a portion of those fees. And so in their mind, that's kind of their commitment to the deal. We had one case, this has probably been 10 plus years ago, where our person absolutely was insistent on getting a deposit. I was like, okay. And it wasn't even a big deposit. It was like $10,000. And, I advised against it. But by the time the attorney started negotiating how they could get the deposit back if the deal doesn't fall through, because, the buyer doesn't want to do that where you get to keep the money if what you said is not true and correct. And so anyway, both parties agreed not to do deposit after they figured out they were going to spend more on the attorneys drafting the document than the deposit was worth. So the other thing that people don't realize sometimes is the letters of intent are typically non-binding, including the price or terms. So if they find something that's material, let's say you say your EBITDA is $2 million and it turns out it's $1.5 million. I mean, if it's competitive enough, sometimes we can get buyers to close over or, kind of close at the price they agreed to. But sometimes they're going to want to, quote, retrade the deal, which is never, what we like to see. And this is, one of those inflection points too, where the balance of power does shift upon execution. If you've got three offers you're looking at and you're kind of trying to pick, which buyer you like the best, you're kind of still in the, proverbial catbird seat. But once you pick the buyer, you're kind of relying on that buyer to do what he or she said they're going to do in the timeline, because they generally want to tie the business up for minimum 60 days, usually, 90 or 120. So it's important to again, trust that the buyer is doing what they say.
Kevin, let me ask you there, because it's come up at least one coaching conversation for
Sure.
me about the deposit piece, and I think it lacked a lot of understanding. But um, selling because you're in a cash flow crisis, how likely is that to be somebody's saving grace, or is the process just too long? And by the way, nobody wants to buy something that's in a cash flow crisis, and you're not going to get a deposit to fix it. I mean, if that's your reason for selling, do you have bigger problems?
Yeah, that one's a tough one. We get calls from time to time with kind of distressed businesses, and really, I think there probably are some buyers out there that can do that, but there's just really no way to run our process to do that. I mean, that might be one of those things where a local competitor is a better buyer, and maybe you can get them to pay you over time if they're able to kind of turn the business around, or they've got better payer contracts or whatever. But um, no buyer, very few buyers are going to do that quickly unless they kind of know the space and can jump in and fix it very quickly. So yeah, for us, that would be a tough one.
And this is the old investment guy in me, but a big part of that, if you're listening to this for the first time or thinking about this, is most of our value, from where I sit, is out there in the future, right? It's money to be earned. It's not like our practices are sitting on $1 million worth of inventory or machinery or land that somebody would buy at a discount in a heartbeat. We're essentially selling them on the future of the business versus a value type proposition, right? Is that fair, Kevin?
Yeah, if you think about that, the reason they look at that EBITDA, and buyers generally like to look at what's called the trailing 12 months EBITDA. We try and push them to buy on, especially a growing business, if we can get them to pay kind of on a forecasted EBITDA. We try to do that. We're not always successful at it, but they look at that trailing 12 months EBITDA as, look, we want that to continue into the future and ideally grow. So yeah, they're definitely looking at it from that perspective.
And with that in mind, with the trailing 12, if you had an anomaly type event that boosted that trailing 12, do they typically want to strip that out in the same way that, we would add back the,
Yeah, I
claim that
mean,
you.
if you think about, like, the perfect examples are the loans that people got during COVID. So the PPP loans, we would see an artificial, call it $1 million in EBITDA, or some of these ER employee credit things. Um, those are, we will generally add or subtract those out because the buyer is never going to buy that. Those are one-time events, just like, if you I don't know, put new paint and carpet in the facility. You're not going to need to do that again for another 5 or 7 years or whatever. So yeah, it
we,
works
we
both
had a
ways.
we had a thing in Arkansas here where Medicaid retroactively raised rates back to like Q3 of a previous year. So all those sessions we had we had $300,000 or $400,000 gift that showed up in our
So
account.
So I would
Go
argue
ahead.
those types of changes. Now, that's a little bit more art than science. I would argue if you get a rate increase, historically, we would go back. Let's say you got a rate increase January 1st, and we're doing a evaluation now, or taking a company to market now, and we've got numbers through February, and we've seen that that rate is now paying. We will go back retroactively and artificially add that rate increase to try and get you credit. And look, I can make a straight face argument on that the buyer is going to get those rates increased going forward, so they should pay for them. And so, the market's a little weird right now, so it's a little harder to argue that. But historically, we've been very successful doing that.
Awesome. Thank you.
So, all right, due diligence. This is probably everybody's least fun part of the process. Um, buyers generally going to give us a different checklist. They're going to give us a checklist from their accounting firm. They're going to give us a checklist from provided that due diligence work stream goes okay. They'll give us one from their billing and coding audit team. They'll give us one from their attorney. There may be an insurance one. There may be just a generic one, depending. So there's lots of different lists that these buyers will provide, and it is fairly, we help manage the process on the back end, but there's still a lot of data that you have to get to us so that we can help you. But
Kevin, are
again,
there any moments for you in due diligence? Like, wait a minute, you guys have what going on? Any stuff that you see derail deals more
yeah, I mean,
frequently?
look, the big joke internally for us is that every deal dies 3 times. And, frankly, I think one of the real values that we provide, or other firms like us, is trying to keep the deal alive, because things always come up in closing. I mean, and a lot of it's not necessarily things that a seller knew they were doing. Maybe they were not. We had a deal where on this particular chart, and this was somebody that took Medicaid, government payer. Every one of their 90837 sessions were on the hour. So it started on the hour and ended on the hour. And that was a huge red flag for the buyer, because clearly not every session you do is going to start and end on the hour. And so the proper coding thing was, if you start at 9:01, you end at 9:55, that's what you need to put in. But their EMR was just, set on auto default to do that. And so yeah, so those types of things we have to work through all the time. Or something pops up. What you don't hope for is like a rate cut during the middle of this process, or something along those lines, because then that's like, oof, that gets tougher. But yeah, there's always issues. Um, the more organized you are, again, just kind of building trust that you've got data to back up what you've given them. This is still a stage where you really are not sharing with anybody. Maybe you brought a key employee or two into the fold, just depending on at this stage, because you're going to need their help, frankly, getting data that you've really never asked for before. All of a sudden people are like, hey, I've never asked my staff for, all the billing data for the last 3 years by line item. So, which is one of the biggest things we need in quality of earnings, just as an FYI. I mentioned kind of problem solving employees. They're kind of your walking assets. And if you've got kind of a good second level management team, or a couple key staff members, buyers are going to want to know, especially if you want to back away a little bit, that person or people are going to stick around. So, it's going to be hard to get through the process without involving them at some point, because the buyer is going to want to include them. And honestly, it may be a plus for the employee. Maybe they'll get some stock options, or sometimes we see owners that will give them kind of a sale bonus, or a bonus if they stick around 6 months post closing, or a year post closing, because that's the it's always funny for us. We go in these management meetings and we see where the buyer's worried that everybody's going to walk out post closing, and the seller's worried that they're going to fire all their key employees. And both sides are worrying about the same thing that neither party wants to happen. The buyer certainly doesn't want all your employees to leave because that's what is generating the revenue. Um, and so, and most of the time the employees don't want to leave either. So anyway,
Kevin, non-competes and 1099 versus W-2, are any of those more advantageous situations for us as sellers if we were to sell a practice?
yeah. So I mean, just to be clear, I'm not an attorney, but we obviously deal with this all the time. Is we generally find most states the non-competes are tougher to enforce, but non-solicits are generally more enforceable. But that's a moving target right now, just with the um, different states. But the non-solicit really that's a little different, where it says, hey, just can't take any clients or go take any employees with you for a period of time. And so that's generally more enforceable. Buyer's going to want the seller to sign a non-compete, generally 5 years long. For sometimes it's a radius around the practice's locations. To we've seen depending on the business where it's national. Um, yeah, that's a little rare. That's for really specialty businesses or they sold a company that dealt in like treating schizophrenics, and they came from all over the country, so they were a very niche business, and so that one was a national non-compete. When we sold
And
our
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say when we sold our home care business, we signed a 10-year non-compete because I would have signed a lifetime ban, would have been fine. Um,
Yeah.
so everybody's got different feelings around non-competes.
And W-2 versus 1099 therapists and providers, that's a hot debate in our
Oh
industry.
yeah,
And
that's a toughie. So I will generally say that 1099 practices are much more difficult to sell than W-2 practices. We did sell one last summer, last spring or summer. That but I will say, and that's still when the market was pretty hot. We got a lot less offers for that, and it was all cash pay too, which makes it more difficult. We can certainly sell cash pay practices and 1099 practices. It's just harder. And the 1090 the reason the buyers don't like the cash pay as much is it's just not as scalable. If you think about really trying to blow out a company after you buy it to grow it, there's just not as many people that are willing to write, depending on the area, $150 to $500, for an hour session, versus people using their commercial insurance. I think I've covered most
does
of it.
that swing the other way, by the way? I know you mentioned problematic billing on the federal or state side. That's that removed if your billing is clean. Is there any premium to federal and state payers being part of your mix, or is the sweet spot all insurance?
I think commercial insurance is going to garner more interest than Medicaid, for example. When somebody's say 50, 60% Medicaid, um, again, you've got a little bit more stroke of the pen risk, meaning if if something changes in Washington or the state government, so there are certain buyers that don't like that. So I would say if I had to kind of say, most interesting to people are commercial payers, then kind of government payers, and then cash pay, kind of in that order. And look, we're still waiting for the perfect business to sell. So, every business has got a little bit different challenges. And so, we tell you things that make it easier to sell, but it is what it is in some cases. You're not going to change if you're all Medicaid to it's just going to limit the buyer universe somewhat. Um, we talked about this a little bit, so I won't beat this, but the quality of earnings is really it's kind of the gating factor with most. If you can get through the quality of earnings with the accounting firm, then the rest of it can be a little bit difficult with the attorneys. I mean, generally attorneys don't kill deals; they just make them take longer and want more documentation. But the accounting firms, if they come in and say, "Look, we're going to convert your financials from cash base," which are you can think about it as checkbook accounting, which is what most small businesses do, is I get money in the bank, I recognize the revenue, and then I pay a bill, and then that's when I recognize the expense. Accrual accounting is what these professional buyers like to convert it to because you can't manipulate it as much. But it says, hey, I'll recognize the revenue when I provide the service, even if I don't get paid for it for 60 days. and same thing with the expenses. So it gives a truer picture of the trends of the business, right? So, um, so if you can get past that, then generally the deal is, and generally buyers will not turn their attorneys loose on their diligence piece until the QOV is done, because that's where they're going to rack up most of their legal fees. So, um, I know I'm kind of running out of time here, so I'll kind of blow through some of this stuff. I mean,
You're okay on my end. I think people are digging this. I've got nothing after.
okay. Um, the clinical and legal diligence, I mean, really, this is just, getting them charts to make sure that you're billing appropriately, that you're documenting what you're billing for. So if you're billing a 90837, they want to make sure it was at least, what is it? I forget, 52, 53 minutes.
53,
Yeah. Things like that. And so, or if you're billing add-on codes, that it's documented correctly. And again, this is just about risk mitigation for these buyers. If you find a significant chart audit, it can be a deal killer too. So if you're billing Medicare or Medicaid improperly, they're just not going to take the risk, especially if it's like 50, 60% of the sample size. Then there's just too much risk for the buyer. So then at that stage, look, you're going to probably need to clean up the way you're doing things. And most of the time it's not intentional. It's really not. It's just lack of, whatever knowledge, oversight, etc. And
Kevin,
again,
not looking for a pat on the back here or anything, but if you are somebody like us that we got CARF certification, we have a director of compliance, we have a QA process, quality assurance process with notes, audits, peer review, all that kind of stuff. That's all stuff that buyers would look at in a positive light. In other words, there's infrastructure here to catch these problems down the road, or
no,
does that
absolutely. I
stuff?
mean, wherever you've got kind of layers of management, it shows you're a little bit more sophisticated of a business versus the owner kind of doing everything, especially as you get to scale. So yeah, absolutely having a director of compliance, and look, you've got to kind of build these things as it makes sense for your business individually. But yeah, that culture of compliance has become much more, especially because I'll talk a little bit in the market section, but I mean, private equity's got their target on them right now from Washington and from many of the states. So they do not want any what they call headline risk. They don't want to buy a business and come in and find out that there's been Medicaid fraud. So, and yeah, it doesn't happen very often, but there was a buyer a couple of years ago that bought a business in the substance abuse space, and after the fact they found all this stuff. The old owner ended up going to jail. So it was, those are the things that they worry about. Um, Purchase agreement, the buyer's attorney is going to prepare this. Generally, we'll see a buyer spend 2 to 4 times more on legal fees than a seller. Just depending on the deal side, because their team is really doing most of the heavy lifting, and they generally have kind of the bigger law firms that are charging $800 to $1,000 an hour just because they need the big name for their investors. I will say though, I do recommend getting an experienced M&A attorney in healthcare. Maybe your local attorney is probably not the best person to do this, just because of kind of the specialty required, and a lot of it's bandwidth too. A lot of these big M&A shops are designed with multiple people that can turn documents more quickly. Now there's obviously a cost associated with that, but um, deal certainty is, I think, enhanced by hiring a firm from the seller's perspective that's experienced. Sometimes, more local ones, they try and make you nervous about the indemnifications, which is really just kind of the warranties that you're giving the buyer. If anything happens, you need to think about it as like, you own the business now. If anything happens, it's your problem. Well, if you sell the business and something pops up from when you own the business, the buyer still wants it to be your problem. So, which is fair if you think about it from a logical perspective. They don't want to, if you were doing something incorrectly and Blue Cross comes back and says, hey, you owe me $100,000 because you overbilled for these charts, they're going to want you to pay that $100,000, even if they were from charts, from when you own the business. They'll assume all the liability from anything that happens with the business going forward from the day of closing, but you own it from kind of pre-closing.
And this
And
goes
sometimes you have
back
to,
to You just, why is the seller selling, right? You mentioned that on the front end. If they're selling to solve a problem or to extricate themselves from a mess, there's a good chance the buyer would not want any part of that.
Yeah, depending on what it is. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Um, Deal killers, we talked about a lot of these, breakdown of trust, too much time, and then inexperienced or overzealous attorneys can do it sometimes too. Because eventually you may come down, if you're dealing with a public company or a big private equity group, it may come down to where your attorney says there's risk here, and you may have to make a business decision and decide whether, hey, okay, I appreciate you explaining the risk to me, but I'm going to go forward anyway. Because, they will warn you that the sky is going to fall tomorrow in some cases. You would never start a business if you asked you. I always joke that you would never start a business if you asked your attorney first. They'd tell you all the risk and why you shouldn't do it. So, um, but you obviously don't want, as you're going through this process, downturn in revenue is never good. The compliance issues, biased advice, lawsuit, and emotions. So the closing, believe it or not, is not like a real estate closing. It's not like where everybody gets together around the table, signs the paperwork, you give them the keys. It is really a non-event. And generally the attorneys are in different states, the buyer and seller are in different states. We're generally in a different state. It's usually a 5-minute call that says we release the paperwork. Well, the buyer tells you they'll release the wires and then they'll shoot you the Fed reference numbers when it's done. So really almost a non-event. Post-closing, I will say the only thing I'm going to mention here is I think most of the time for outpatient mental health companies, buyers going to want you to stick around for some period of time. Now, whether, I say 30 days is very rare. Usually it's going to be 6 to 12 months, and many of them want you to stick around indefinitely if you're going to roll equity. So it just depends on the buyer. The benefit to selling is you take some money off the table, you kind of diversify your personal balance sheet and kind of use their money, and hopefully you can make more money on the next time they sell if you roll 30% or whatever.
And Kevin, that seems to be a driver of a lot of these conversations I'm having is burnout on the part of the owner. And I think if I'm hearing you correctly, or based on my experience, you can probably, or you can theoretically find buyers who will let you walk away the day you sign, but typically that's going to affect your price in a downward fashion. They're going to want you to stick around as part of continuity. In other words, you selling your business to get out of the day to day maybe a little pie in the sky for some of these transactions.
Depends on the size of the business. But yeah, I mean, if you say, hey, I want to go the next day, I'm going to throw my keys over the shoulder and you can have it. Yeah, that's definitely going to affect your price. But we sold a business. This owner, I mean, it was a nice business. It was a little under $5 million in EBITDA. Owner was working 10, 15 hours a week. The buyer wanted him to roll equity. He was really nervous at first on rolling equity because he was afraid that they were going to all of a sudden say, you got to start working 40 hours a week. And the thing was like, no, I'm, we just, as long as you communicate clearly, I'm not going to all of a sudden start working 40 hours a week when I've been working 10 or 15. So as long as you set expectations appropriately, you can generally kind of keep working the same amount, or you can say, look, I want to somewhat, transition out slowly. And there needs to be some thought on how you do that. And I know probably not, that's a longer discussion, but there's certainly ways you can transition out. Um, especially the more you have a good team in place, makes it easier. But they still want to know, look, if you've still got some skin in the game, even if you transition out and you're sitting on the beach in Florida, they can still call you to help fix a problem.
Yeah, consultant basically. So
Yeah.
in the industry right now, EOS. I'm not sure if you're familiar with EOS, Kevin. But the whole traction book and EOS as a
Yeah, I'm
kind of a
familiar.
management structure is one of the hot things. We're an EOS company. It was a game changer for me as an owner, workload wise. Is stuff like that attractive to
Yeah,
buyers of like, oh,
whether it's EOS or you've just got the pieces in place and it's your own system, but certainly the more you can show the business can run without you, and you're taking a vacation for a month at a time, then yeah, absolutely. All right, so why don't we move into the market update here? So we've been tracking behavioral health trends since like 2016, and I just got the last 4 years up here. This is all behavioral health deals, and so for us, that's ABA or autism, IDD, substance abuse, and then mental health. And whether it's inpatient or outpatient, for mental health and substance abuse, it's kind of the same from our tracking perspective. So just graphically, you can see here that, I mean, 21 and 22 were crazy busy years. 21, I mean, COVID was really good, as you probably all are aware, for behavioral health companies for a couple reasons. It showed that behavioral health companies were not only recession resistant, they were fairly pandemic resistant, where historically dental and dermatology and practices like that were considered very safe investments. They often shut down during COVID for a month or two, depending on the state. So behavioral health was very attractive. So there's a lot of interest. And then in 2021, President Biden was indicating he was trying to get a increase in the capital gains tax rate here. So there was a bunch of deals in late 21, and capital gains are basically taxes you pay on sale of business. And so it was going to cost materially more if you sold your business on January 1st versus December 31st. So there were a lot of deals that got pushed into this quarter. Now, that never ended up happening, but that's what artificially kind of drove. That's why this spike is so big. And then, um, I still think some of the COVID effect here is really what kept transactions high through 2022. Q1 of 2023 is really when we started. 2023 is really when we saw a decline in the overall transaction volume, but it's really kind of going back to pre-pandemic levels. So it's not the sky is falling. It's just that these 2 years were and really kind of artificially high. I would say we're as busy as we've ever been. It has gotten more difficult to get deals actually closed for a variety of reasons. There was a fairly well-known buyer in this space that recently pulled back and decided not to pursue acquisitions, at least until they say the end of the year, beginning of, well, they said the end of the year. I personally think it'll be till next year, and I won't name them, but I'm sure you guys probably can figure out who it is, or many of you know. Um,
Even
so
saw existing deals pulled off the table, right? Like, I mean,
yeah,
stuff that hadn't been inked
yeah,
yet,
they
but
walked away from a number of deals that were under LOI that were supposed to close. Well, one of them they walked away from two of ours. Um, One of them was supposed to close in February, and they told us that in beginning of February. So it was kind of a very abrupt uh, decision. So, and they kind of let go of their whole corporate development department, which is the group that does the buying for them, or not the whole department, but kind of the head of it. So, and anyway, look, I mean, they're wonderful people. I like them as human beings. I just think they bought too many companies too quickly, and so trying to digest some of that. But really good folks, and I hope they are able to kind of come back to the market. But this graph, what this one shows to me, if I'm in your shoes from the outpatient mental health business, which I think everybody on this is outpatient mental health, correct? So
yeah.
I kind of took out just the mental health piece. So if you look at the mental health piece, it declined a little bit from 2022, but it's still higher than it was in 21 and 20. So really, the outpatient mental health businesses are really what kept the behavioral stats as high as they were, because honestly, the substance abuse was really dead last year. Autism was slow. And so, the silver lining for mental health businesses is that it was still kind of the shining star in behavioral. Now, and these different colors here, just to show you who the buyers are, really the dark blue and the green were basically private equity platforms, which means when somebody's buying they don't own anything in the space, their first purchase is generally a little bit larger, and it's called a platform. And so there were nine, like in Q4, there was 9 private equity platforms. And then there was 7 deals that were owned by private equity groups that already had a platform. So they were doing what they call tuck-ins. So I think the positive thing, if you look at just the number of private equity platforms over the last 6 quarters, there was a lot of platforms. And now I think some of these people are still digesting those, but ultimately they're going to need to do, call it 5 to 10 tuck-in acquisitions to for them to be able to exit, right? So for them to get the goal is they'll hold it for 3 to 5 to 7 years, but in order to for them to have a successful exit, they're going to have to grow it. So they'll probably open some new offices, but they're going to need to buy things. And when you see this many platform acquisitions, those groups are ultimately going to have to buy again. Now that may not start happening until end of this year, beginning of next year, but ultimately there's going to be a lot of pent up demand once rates come down and buyers start buying again.
Kevin, when you say tuck in, is that synonymous with roll up?
Yeah, that's not synonymous with roll up. It's kind of a tuck in is just one acquisition of part of a roll up strategy. So,
Gotcha.
um, look, what we're seeing in the market is definitely slowed in terms of the number of offers we're getting versus what we were getting, say, a year ago. The multiples are down a little bit, or it can be materially down. It depends. So a couple examples is we sold I'll call it a $1.3 million business, $1.3 million in EBITDA business early last year. Um, that was at a double-digit multiple, and we have a very similar business that we just got offers in. We got much fewer offers, and really kind of the high range was 6 to 7 times. So multiples have come down materially there. Um, but we just sold a psychiatry practice for double-digit multiples. So I will say that buyers are still willing to pay for the right business that meets their strategic needs. Um, I will say that psychiatry practice or people that are providing psychiatry services, even if they don't have a psychiatrist, some states can use mid-levels, or maybe just have a psychiatrist oversight doing some of the med management stuff. Um, but that can be very profitable line of business, especially if you're kind of billing it correctly. And so I think psychiatry businesses, people that are offering, maybe some TMS, some Spravato, ketamine, in addition to maybe psychotherapy, will garner more interest in the marketplace today. And generally a little bit larger businesses, really, the sub-$1 million EBITDA businesses have definitely become harder to sell than they were, just a year or so ago. And look, obviously I'm not happy with that, but we try and be very direct and upfront with kind of what we're seeing in the market. And that's definitely what we're seeing at the moment. Um, look, we're working with some now that I think we will get sold. But it's just taking a little bit more work and not as many offers as we would have gotten, like I said, a year or two ago. Um,
Kevin, let me,
you know,
and
the,
you may address, oops, sorry, go ahead.
go ahead.
You may address this somewhere else, but for the practice owner that's listening that has 300,000 in EBITDA and half of that is attributable to their own caseload, that's probably not somebody who's going to sell through somebody like you. Is that correct?
Yeah, that one would be very tough for us. Especially we would have to adjust for the caseload, meaning, if you're generating $300,000 in revenue and you're paying your clinicians 50% of that, we would, have to kind of do a negative deduct of 150,000 because a new buyer would have to pay you or somebody else to kind of take that over. But yeah, 300,000 would be very tough right now. But look, we're always happy to talk to those folks. I mean, there's a number of companies that we've sold that we've done valuations for. I mean, I'm working with a deal right now. 10 years I've known these people, and they finally, said they were ready to go. So it's in the substance abuse space, but we're always happy to gauge early, especially if you're small now, but you've got, you plans to grow. We're happy to tell you, look, here's what it's worth today. And if you get to kind of these numbers in the future, based on today's market, here's what we think. So we're happy to have the conversation at least.
And even probably a little direction in or a checklist, if you will, as you grow. Here's what would make you more sellable for Mertz Taggart 5 years from now. Focus on these
Yeah, and
things.
we're happy to kind of roll the valuation forward on an annual basis and tell you what we see, what different things and based on current market conditions. And yeah, certainly if you can do these things, it's going to make you more attractive. The other thing I was about to say was that, the buyer universe has changed a little bit too. A lot of the buyers in the behavioral space, um, there's still lots of buyers out there, but they've like if you look at Refresh and LifeStance, they're really the ones that kind of started the whole outpatient mental health business. I mean, there really wasn't much of a market for those prior to 2016 and 17 when those groups got started buying. Now they were paying much lower multiples back then. And LifeStance has had some pretty, I mean, I don't think it's any secret to anybody. They've had some struggles. They're shutting a bunch of offices. They're trying to get some costs under control. I mean, they publicly said they weren't buying anything in 2023 and wouldn't start looking again until this year. But I still don't know that they're going to do anything. So I'm not sure the last time they bought something. I want to say it was probably, I'd have to go back and look, maybe 2022. And then Refresh, they were sold to Optum. Well, they were sold to private equity group and then to Optum, which is United Healthcare. And so they kind of took a pause for a while, but they're back in the market. Just albeit they're very slow. They work at the pace of somewhat of an insurance company. So buyers change, all the time. We've got a bunch of new entrants in the market. So I think the second half of 2024 will show some better numbers or some better trends. And I think with that, I don't have a whole lot more. I'm happy to
Yeah,
answer
let
a
me.
few more questions. I've got about 10 minutes or so if there's questions.
Perfect. So I've got 4 or 5 questions that have rolled in different ways. So one, if somebody operates in another geographical space like Canada, is that something that Mertz Taggart deals in? Do you refer up there? Do you have any thought on that? Practices owned in the Canadian space versus American or U.S. space?
So we've sold a business in Canada. I mean, a total of one. So I don't have a ton of experience in Canada. We're happy to have a conversation. We're selling a company to a Canadian buyer right now. So I think it just depends on kind of the size of the business and whatnot. But yeah, that's just not an area that we've done. I can't point to you and say we've done 10 deals in Canada. We've done 2 international deals, one in the UK and one in Canada, but most of our deals are in the US.
So earlier you mentioned KPIs and all that kind of stuff. Besides EBITDA, are there KPIs that acquiring practices, buyers really like to focus on? Is it weekly caseload? Is it clinician retention? What other KPIs matter to a buyer?
Yeah, actually, the one you just touched on, clinician retention, turnover is a big one that we've gotten because there's been so much turnover, um, over the last year or two with either people going to groups like Headway or starting their own practice. So clinician turnover is definitely a stat they're going to want to see. They're going to want to see, either weekly visit trends kind of on a, monthly, and we need to show these kind of on a monthly basis so they can see trends. Um, Number of clinicians. I think, historically we call it kind of average length of stay for a client, but you know, mental health practices generally track those on kind of like the average number of sessions that a typical client gets. And so the higher that number is, the better, because it just shows that your clients are sticking around. They're going to want to see payer metrics. So if you're commercial insurance, they're going to want to see, it's 10% cash pay, 90% commercial, and then within the commercial, it's 77% Blue Cross or whatever the numbers are. So yeah, the private equities can never have too much data, especially if it's in Excel. They love their data.
Well,
And we like it too because it helps us tell a better story and understand where the roadblocks are up front. Like Illinois, for instance, Blue Cross is one of the biggest payers, and we've got a company that's like 80 something percent Blue Cross. So there's some risk there. But
love it. So, and I'll make the commercial for semi-private practice here. employee engagement numbers, leadership assessment numbers, these are all things that help you move that needle in the right direction as far as employee retention. I would also imagine that trusted metrics from trusted instruments would always be of interest to a buyer. In other words, if you have engagement scores from Predictive Index, which we do and can help practices do, or collective leadership assessment scores or 360 scores, things like that, that show employee satisfaction and engagement, that's always going to, one, help you lead better. Two, I think tell the story that you're talking about, Kevin, which is we've got people that love being here. They don't want to leave. In other words, you don't need to fear that as long as you as a buyer don't screw it up.
Yeah,
That's a good.
we have a client that uses Gusto, and they've kind of got some pre-built employee satisfaction things they send out every month, and the buyer really wanted to dig into those. So
Yeah. That seems like one of the biggest risks. I mean, to me, that was why I, for years, have thought that these large platforms didn't know what they were getting into. Is all of us that own group practices know how hard it is to keep employees, even if you have a non-compete. There that it's there's a lot of temptation to walk if you get bought out by corporate. So you need to have a very strong story on why people are going to stick around, which means you got to be a place that people want to stick around. So, Kevin, what is the bathroom remodel of the practice sale world? In other words, when you sell a house, right, one of the biggest places you can invest money that you'll get it back is remodeling the bathroom,
the
kitchen.
bathroom.
Is there a therapy practice remodel version? In other words, if you're going to spend money to get your practice ready for sale, here's some of the high ROI investments you can make.
Yeah, the thing with this versus like in that example, if you're going to sell a house, you can have a contractor come in and remodel the bathroom in say a month or whatever. Most of these trends that buyers are going to be looking for, it's hard to remodel the bathroom the business in a month. I mean, so I think if you know you're going to sell and you want to sell in say 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, I mean, the biggest thing is kind of growing the revenue and EBITDA. And one of the things that we see sometimes smaller practices don't do a good job of is kind of cost containment on what they're paying their clinicians. And I'm not suggesting that you don't pay your clinicians a fair wage, but if you're paying them 75% of what you're collecting, you're going to struggle to sell that practice. Um, because the buyers, there's just not enough gross margin there. Meaning, if you collect $100 from Blue Cross and you're paying 75, that $25 just isn't enough to run the rest of the business profitably, because that's almost all your margin. So I think those things. I think maybe adding, if I were going to do it, the ones I see more valuable these days are the ones that do have the med management services, much more desirable. Um, Look, there's a lot of psychiatrists that have, kind of single psychiatry practices that, frankly, aren't worth a ton of money to sell either. Maybe there's a way to partner with a psychiatrist to kind of add those services and let him or her retire over time. Um, really the ones that are profitable too are the ones that use the mid levels. So the psych NPs, the PAs, depending on your state. So I would think those would be the most. And just watching that, you really need to have a minimum 15% bottom line EBITDA number. More ideal is 20 to 30%. So
And for anybody listening that doesn't fit into a Kevin Taggart's world as far as sales, we are kind of embarking on that phase where we're looking at absorption type partnerships. So if you are needing to consider an exit and are not saleable, but want a smooth exit with some payout, we'd love to talk to you. I'll give you my contact info at the end as well. So we're an option for some of your smaller players. Kevin, if somebody wants to get a hold of you and start a discussion and get evaluation, what's the best way to do that?
there's my contact info on the screen, but the email is probably the best way. Or you can text me, but honestly, I generally don't. I get so many phone calls, I don't answer if I don't know where it's coming from, and my day is pretty tightly scheduled. But always happy to set up a call. Email is probably the easiest way to do it, or text, but email is preferred.
Perfect. Anybody interested in talking to me, you can visit semiprivatepractice.com. We've got all kinds of coaching stuff there to help kind of that slow pivot over 2 or 3 years, the bathroom remodel. You can also email me, Ken at Chenal, CHENAL therapy.com, or Ken at semiprivatepractice.com. One last question, Kevin, that popped up. Does the EHR you use matter at all in saleability? Are there EHRs that tend to get more favorable responses or less favorable?
That's a good question. We have that in our home care practice. There's one particular EHR that most of the big strategics use. So in that case, yes. In the outpatient mental health space, I would say no. The biggest thing is you just need to make sure you can get the billing reports out of it, the detail. So for the last really 2 years and kind of year to date is at a minimum what they need to do the quality of earnings. And so some of the smaller ones are brutal to get that data out. And then but no, I don't think I would, especially because some of the bigger ones are frankly cost prohibitive for a smaller practice.
Yeah. Kevin, thank you so much for the time today. I know you got to run. That was super helpful. We'll answer a lot of questions for a lot of practice owners. So thank you, everybody, for attending. Again, look up Mertz Taggart, Kevin Taggart. I think he's one of the best in the business, straight shooter, good guy. Eventually, it'll be my turn, and Kevin will be my in that process. In the interim, again, if we can help you with anything, including we've got our monthly practice owner calls called Coffee with Ken. Visit us at semiprivatepractice.com, and we'd love to have you join us. So thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Sarah, my intrepid leader here, for setting this up. What were you going to
Yes.
say, Kevin?
I was just going to say thank you to Ken and Sarah as well. I appreciate you guys having me on. It's my pleasure.
Very cool. We'll talk again soon, Kevin.
All
Take
right.
care,
Thanks,
everybody. Have
guys.
a great
Bye-bye.
day.